Hey audio geekheads, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, do consider subscribing. Just pop the red button below the video. Today it's time for another product review, and we will be looking at these, the Ikko OH1S, which are newly released by Ikko Audio, and you might think they're the successor to the previous OH1, but in fact they are not. They're much more expensive at £179 in the UK, $199 in the US. So before we go any further, as always, a quick disclaimer. Ikko were very kind enough to send me 2 sets of the OH1S gems, as they call them. They also sent me a couple of balanced cables with 2.5mm jacks. But of course, they didn't have any input into the review, and they have no editorial control whatsoever. Now, for such a small pair of IEMs, you get a rather hefty box, which I'm never that much of a fan of in terms of environmental impact, etc. So lift the lid, and you can see the IEMs themselves. I've actually opened these and put them back so they're not as perfect as they were when I got them. And this rather bizarre Eco Fox badge thing. I can't imagine anyone who'd want to wear that as a fashion statement. Now, the first problem I encountered was actually getting the IEMs out of the foam insert. They look so beautiful, don't they, sat there, but it's so hard to get them out. And in the end, I had to resort to gently tapping them into the box and they plop out. And I mean, I know it's a nitpicky thing, but I think if you're going to make such a nice pair of IEMs, at least make them easy to get out of the box. Our first impressions in terms of build are very promising. So this is the blue pair. I'll show you the purple pair, the purple grey pair in a minute. They are very nice, both to look at and to hold. They're nicely textured on the outside. They're really small, and they've got a nice solid feel about them. The nozzle feels sturdy. It's got a filter on it. And it's a bizarre shape. It's slightly oval, not ovular as I've heard some reviewers call it. It's definitely oval, and there's a little grill there. Now, the connection to the cable is an MMCX. Interestingly, I put a poll up as to which connection you prefer, and a lot of you plumped for 2-pin. You then get this annoying envelope, which again is difficult to get out of the box. I haven't actually looked inside it. I'm sure it'll be rubbish. And then, as you can see, you get a huge array of ear tips, predominantly silicone ones in various sizes. I mean, look at the size of those bad boys there. I don't know who has ears like that. They are a little bit oval as well. I tried a few pairs of these silicone ear tips and I couldn't get a good seal, so thankfully you also get some foamy ones. I could only really get the smallest foamies to fit. All the others exert an incredible amount of painful pressure. You get the cable, which is a standard single-ended 3.5mm jack, and then you get this rather useless carrying case. I mean, it looks nice, but trying to put the IEMs themselves in there is a tight fit, and you don't get any form of latch. You get this silly leather string, which I think you're meant to wind round somehow. Now, there is a reason why these blue IEMs remain in the box, despite the fact that I prefer the colour to the purpley grey ones, which I'll show in a minute. And that is because, sadly, there were quality control issues with this pair. So try as I might, I could not get the MMCX connector to fit securely onto the left IEM body. So I'd put it in and it would click in place, but it kept popping out spontaneously. That's really disappointing. For 170 quid, I'd expect a secure cable connection. The other point to make concerning the build is that because the nozzle is this odd oval shape, you might have trouble fitting third-party ear tips to it. So here is the other colour that the OH1S comes in. It's a kind of a grey outer shell, gunmetal grey outer shell with this purple highlighting of the plastic strip. Again, it looks quite classy, and you can see I've attached the small foamy ear tip and the cable. And actually the cable's quite nice. It winds pretty nicely. It doesn't tangle. It's got this plastic covering and it's braided. As I say, it terminates in an MMCX connection. Thankfully, with these purple ones, I didn't have any trouble with the fit and no accidental disconnections. But we're getting to the important bit of the review now, which is how the OH1S sound. And first of all, let's have a look at the frequency response curve here, which is courtesy of Superstar Reviews. So what you can see here is a grey line representing that particular target frequency response that Superstar prefers, and then on the red line here we have the actual performance of the OH1S, and there are a few notable features. So we start off in the bass region. It certainly is well below Superstar's target, and as we enter the mid-range you can see that lower mid-range is pretty much in line with the target, but then as we get above 1K it falls off a bit here and then drops just at the upper limit of the mid-range at 4K. Presumably that's to reduce the shoutiness. Where it really gets interesting though is in the treble region, particularly in the 7.5K range, and you can see there's an absolutely huge peak here which is well above this particular target reference, and we'll come back to how that affects the sound in real world listening. We then get treble roll off at about 13K here, although there's another peak just at the limit of audibility, which I certainly couldn't hear. So let's talk about real world performance then, and I've been using these Ikko OH1S with a range of sources. So I've been listening through the single-ended connection on my FIO M3K, which is a great little DAP. Go and check out my video on that if you haven't done so already. Great machine, that one. I've also been using my other favourite FIO product, the BTR5 Bluetooth receiver. I've been predominantly using it actually as a wired DAC using the USB-C, and I've been using the balanced cable that Ikko very kindly sent me. Here it is, look, it goes into the 2.5mm input. Incidentally, this balanced cable is a little bit thicker and heavier than the single-ended cable, but it feels pretty good quality. In terms of the music I've been listening to, there's been all sorts. At the moment you can see I've got Anima by Tom York playing, which is a fabulous album from a couple of years ago. I've also been listening to a lot of Kristin Hersh recently, so last night I was playing her debut album Hips and Makers, which is predominantly an acoustic affair. What else have we had? Plenty of Nirvana, a little bit of early REM. This album's fantastic, by the way, Double Roses by Karen Elson. Oh, Taylor Swift, always love a bit of Taylor. There's a national for Matt Berninger's baritone vocals, so a lot of music, as you can see. After hitting them with hours and hours of varied music, then what conclusions can I draw about how the OH1S perform? So first of all, there are some things I really like about the sound of these IEMs, and let's start with the Soundstage, which is actually incredibly wide for a pair of IEMs. Typically IEMs have a very closed-in soundstage, but these definitely describe a much wider soundstage. If the mix is nice and spacious, and that's reflected well in the sound of the OH1S. I would say it's definitely wider than it is deeper, and going with a good soundstage is also pretty good imaging and separation, so you can generally pinpoint exactly where the sounds are coming from, and there's really good separation even between similar sounding instruments. Let's talk about the bass next, and you saw from the graph that the bass appeared to be a bit thin on the ground, and certainly in terms of quantity there isn't enough. I would describe these as just on the bass light side of neutral. Certainly if you're a bass head you'll come away quite disappointed. However, what it lacks in quantity it makes up for partly in quality. So the bass, when you can hear it, is really nicely controlled, really well articulated. It's got really excellent attack and decay, so you do get that little bit of slam, even though it's not the loudest. Moving on to the mid-range, it's a very vocal forward pair of IEMs. So the lower mid-range is less well represented than the higher mid-range. And what this results in is some instruments, and particularly male vocals, feeling a little bit lean, a little bit hollow if you like. So for example, when Bono lets rip with his full-throated roar on something like With or Without You or One, he just sounds not quite right, a little bit lacking. Female vocalists, however, like Kristin Hersh and Tanya Donnelly, for example, from Throwing Muses, they sound much better, and it's a real problem if you enjoy cello music. So for example, Yo-Yo Ma's Bach cello concertos, the cello just lacks that body because of the lack of bass and the slightly suppressed lower mid-range. But let's get to treble, and that's where my real problems with this IEM lie. You saw that massive hump at the 7.5K frequency band. And what that means is that these are perhaps some of the most sibilant and slightly painful IEMs to listen to that I've heard. So for example, if you're listening to James Blake, who tends to sing in a very high register, when he sings S's and T's, you can really hear the sibilance coming over quite strongly, and it almost feels quite painful to listen to. Now this is even worse because when you're listening to modern electronic music and you want to turn the bass up a bit because it's a bit lacking, you up the volume, and then you get this ear-piercing treble with lots and lots of sibilance, and I actually found them really fatiguing, more so than most pairs of IEMs I've tried recently. In fact, they put me in mind of these, the KZ-ZSN Pro X's, which I tested a few months ago. And while these have a lot more bass, they also have this kind of very, very powerful upper mid-range and treble, which makes them quite fatiguing. But again, I keep saying it, for £170, I don't want a pair of IEMs that are uncomfortable for listening to over long periods. Now, I have read on HeadFi that you can mod these by putting a little bit of tape over this inner vent, the vent that faces your ear, and it somewhat dampens that piercing treble. I haven't tried it. I will try it and report back at some point in the community tab. However, I don't think you should have to mod IEMs just to get a more pleasing tonality. Now, if you are an absolute treble head, you might enjoy these, because one of the benefits of having such an accentuated treble is you do get a sense of air around the instruments. The cymbals and the hi-hats do hit way too hard on these OH1Ss, and sometimes they distract you from the rest of the music. If Ikko had just toned down that treble a bit, I think I'd really, really like them. I think they'd be really nice in terms of separation and imaging and soundstage, so it's such a shame that they've got that horrible treble hump. So I'm afraid I can't recommend them at all. You'd be far better off, in my opinion, with the much cheaper and much better Moondrop Arias at £70, a whole £100 cheaper than these. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Let me know what you think. Have you got a pair of these yet? Do you like them? Am I being really unfair? It's always great to hear your comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.